The year is 1887, the Norwegian Arctic, minus 40 degrees, and you are completely alone. Not the kind of alone where you miss people, the kind of alone where the silence itself starts to feel like something is listening, where every creak of frozen wood sounds like a decision being made, where the wind doesn't just howl, it communicates. You have been stationed at Telegraph station Nordcap for 6 months. Your job is simple. Receive messages, send messages, log the time. You have done this 183 days in a row without a single incident. Until tonight. Tonight the lines went quiet at exactly 11:47 p.m. Not quiet like a technical failure. Quiet like something cut them. And then, 4 minutes later, a single message came through. Broken. Fragmented, like whoever was sending it was running out of time. It said 3 words. Before you hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that will make you question every sound you hear tonight, I want you to understand something. What you are about to hear is not a ghost story. It is not a myth. This is a documented story recovered from the personal logs of telegraph operator Emil Voss, whose station was found completely abandoned on January 3, 1888. No body was ever recovered. No footprints leaving the station were ever found, only incoming ones. Now lock your doors, turn off your lights, and whatever you do, do not look out your window, because this is where Emil's story begins. My name is Emil Voss, and I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened to me in those frozen mountains above the Arctic Circle. Something that I have never been able to fully explain. Something that has kept me awake every single night for the past 312 days, staring at the ceiling of whatever room I find myself in, listening, always listening, for the sound that I heard on that first night at Telegraph station Nordcap. I was 26 years old when the Norwegian Telegraph Authority assigned me to the northern station, a posting that most operators in Oslo considered a punishment. A place you got sent when you had done something wrong, or when nobody else wanted you. A crooked little building perched on the edge of the world like a forgotten tooth, surrounded on all sides by nothing but ice and darkness, and the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums like 2 cold hands trying to get inside your skull. I had been told the previous operator, a man named Torsten Hagen, had left the post early due to what the authority described in their paperwork as psychological exhaustion, which I thought nothing of at the time because the isolation alone was enough to break most men. And I was young and arrogant and absolutely certain that I was not most men. The journey to the station took 4 days by dog sled through terrain that seemed to actively resist my presence, through valleys so deep and so dark that the sun never reached the bottom of them, through forests of dead black pine trees that stood so perfectly still in the freezing air that they looked less like trees and more like something that had been standing there waiting for centuries, through stretches of open tundra where the wind came screaming across the ice with a sound so close to a human voice that I caught myself turning around more than once, convinced that someone was calling my name from somewhere behind me in the white. The musher who drove me to the station was a weathered old man named Bjorn, who had not spoken a single word to me for the entire first 3 days of our journey. And on the 4th day, as the station finally came into view on the horizon, a small dark shape against an enormous gray sky, he pulled the dogs to a stop and turned to look at me with eyes that were so pale they were almost colorless. And he said to me in a voice so low, I had to lean forward to hear it over the wind. He said that I should keep my lamps burning through the night, every night, without exception, and that I should never, under any circumstances, open the door after dark, regardless of what I heard outside, regardless of what it sounded like, regardless of whether it sounded like a person in desperate need of help. I asked him what he meant by that. He did not answer me. He simply clicked his tongue at the dogs and drove away without looking back, and I stood there in the snow outside my new home for the next 6 months, watching him disappear into the white until there was nothing left of him but a dark smudge on the horizon, and then nothing at all. and the silence that rushed in to fill the space where the sound of the sled had been was so complete, so absolute, so suffocating, that for the first time since I had accepted this posting, I felt something cold move through my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. I picked up my bag, I walked to the door, and somewhere out in the darkness beyond the tree line, something that I could not see made a sound that I have never been able to forget. The inside of Telegraph Nordcap was smaller than I had imagined, smaller than the blueprints the authority had shown me in Oslo had suggested, a single rectangular room divided by a heavy wool curtain into two sections, the front section containing the telegraph equipment and a small wooden desk scarred with the knife marks and cigarette burns of every operator who had sat there before me, and the back section containing nothing but a narrow cot, a cast iron stove that would become the most important object in my life for the next 6 months, and a single shelf of books left behind by previous occupants, their spines cracked and their pages swollen with moisture. Titles I recognized and titles I did not, and one book at the very end of the shelf with no title at all, just a plain dark cover with something written on the inside page in handwriting so small and so frantic that I had to hold the page directly under the lamp to read it. I did not read it that first night. I told myself it was because I was tired from the journey, because my fingers were still numb from the cold and my eyes were burning from 4 days of staring into the white. But the truth, I have only recently been able to admit to myself, is that something about that handwriting made me deeply and instinctively uneasy, in a way I could not explain, the way you feel when you walk into a room and sense that something has just happened there, something that left a mark on the air itself, something that the walls remember, even if you do not. I spent my first evening at the station conducting what the authority called an operational inventory, checking that the telegraph equipment was functioning correctly, that the lines running out from the station into the darkness were intact and properly connected, that the lamp oil reserves were sufficient for the coming months. And as I worked, I became aware of something that I had not noticed when I first arrived, something that took me almost an hour to identify because it was not a presence but an absence, which is always so much harder to name. There were no animal sounds. In my experience, even in the most remote locations, even in the deepest winter, there is always something alive in the darkness outside, the distant bark of a fox, the movement of a bird through frozen branches, the soft crunch of some small creature navigating the snow. But outside Telegraph Station Nordcap there was nothing, an absolute and total biological silence that extended in every direction as far as the darkness went, which in the Norwegian Arctic in January is very far indeed, and which on that first night felt less like the absence of animals and more like the absence of anything that had made a decision to be somewhere else, somewhere safer, somewhere far away from whatever it was that lived in the black between the trees. I checked the door was bolted. I checked it a second time. I checked it a third time, and then stood with my hand flat against the cold wood for almost a full minute, feeling the vibration of the wind against the other side, feeling the way the entire station seemed to shudder with each gust like a living thing flinching from a blow. And I thought about what the musher Bjorn had said to me, about keeping the lamps burning, about not opening the door after dark regardless of what I heard outside. And I thought about Torsten Hagen and his psychological exhaustion, and I wondered, for the first time but not the last, exactly what it was that Torsten Hagen had heard. I went to bed with every lamp in the station burning, and at exactly 2:17 in the morning, I was pulled from a dead sleep by a sound from directly outside the door that I can only describe as something very large and very deliberate, dragging itself slowly across the outer wall of the station from one end to the other, pausing at the door, and then going completely still. I lay in that cot for 47 minutes without moving, without breathing more than I absolutely had to, with my eyes fixed on the wool curtain separating my sleeping area from the front of the station, watching the way the lamplight flickered against it, and telling myself with every rational thought I had left that what I had heard was the wind, that it was ice shifting against the exterior walls, that it was the natural settling of a wooden structure in extreme cold, that there was a perfectly logical explanation for every sound this building made, and that I was an educated man of 26 working for the Norwegian Telegraph Authority, and I did not believe in things that dragged themselves across walls in the middle of the Arctic night. At 3:04 in the morning, the telegraph machine started clicking. I want you to understand what that meant in terms of the geography of my situation, because it is important, because it is the detail that has haunted me more than any other in the years since that night, more than the sound against the wall, more than what I eventually saw, more than the way the story ended. And it is this: the nearest telegraph station to Nordcap was 112 kilometers to the south, a station called Hammerfest, staffed by 2 operators named Lars and Frederick, who worked alternating 12-hour shifts and who were the only human beings within communicating distance of my position. And for that machine to be receiving a transmission at 3:04 in the morning meant that either Lars or Frederick had chosen to send a message in the absolute dead of night, which was unusual but not impossible, or that someone or something else entirely was operating a telegraph machine somewhere out there in the darkness between my station and Hammerfest. I got out of the cot. I pushed through the wool curtain into the front section of the station and sat down at the desk, and I watched the machine print its message onto the paper tape with the slow and deliberate rhythm of someone who knew exactly what they were saying and wanted to make absolutely certain that every single word was received correctly. And the message that came through, the message that I transcribed into my log with a hand that I am not ashamed to tell you was shaking, was this: do not go outside. Do not extinguish your lamps. It has been watching the station since before you arrived. We tried to warn Haugen. He did not listen. Please listen. It hunts by sound in the dark. It is drawn to silence. Whatever you hear tonight, do not open that door. Do not let it know you are afraid. It can smell fear the way a wolf smells blood through 3 feet of snow. And whatever you do not answer this message. I sat at that desk for a very long time staring at those words on the paper tape, reading them over and over again in the flickering lamplight, while the wind threw itself against the walls of the station with a fury that seemed to be building with every passing minute. And I thought about all the rational explanations I had assembled for myself over the past 47 minutes, and I watched every single one of them dissolve like frost on a warm hand. Then I did the thing I should not have done. The thing I knew even as my fingers were moving toward the telegraph key that I absolutely should not do. The thing that every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to stop. The thing that I have replayed in my mind every single day since that night, wondering what would have happened if I had simply pushed my chair back from that desk and walked away. I sent a reply. I tapped out 3 words into the Arctic darkness and waited, and the silence that followed was so thick and so complete that I became suddenly and absolutely certain that whatever was outside that door had also gone completely still, and was also waiting, and was also listening. My 3 words were, "Who are you?" The machine did not answer, but something outside the door did. I need you to understand something about sound in the Arctic, something that most people who have never been that far north will never have the opportunity to learn, which is that cold air that sits at -40 degrees for weeks at a time, does something to sound that warmer air does not. It carries it differently. It stretches it and sharpens it and delivers it to your eardrums with a clarity so extreme and so unforgiving that you can hear things from distances that should make hearing them impossible. You can hear ice cracking on a frozen lake 3 kilometers away. You can hear the breath of a reindeer moving through snow half a kilometer to the north. You can hear, if the night is still enough and the cold is deep enough, the sound of your own heartbeat reflected back at you off the surface of the snow like a mirror made of silence. I tell you this because I need you to understand that what I heard on the other side of that door was not far away. It was not the kind of sound that the Arctic carries to you from a distance, stretched and sharpened and made strange by the cold. It was not something happening somewhere out in the darkness beyond the tree line. It was not the sound of a creature moving through the snow, or dragging itself across the frozen ground, or breathing in the shadows between the pine trees. It was none of those things. It was something far worse than all of those things combined, because what I heard on the other side of that door, no more than 30 centimeters of frozen oak between it and me, was the sound of something breathing, slowly, deliberately, with a rhythm so controlled and so patient that it did not sound like the breathing of an animal acting on instinct, but like the breathing of something that had made a conscious decision to let me hear it, something that understood exactly what the sound of its own breath would do to the man sitting on the other side of that door in the Ratto, with his hand still resting on the telegraph key, and his 3 unanswered words hanging in the Arctic air between them. I did not move. I have read accounts of men in extreme situations describing time as slowing down, describing a kind of crystalline clarity that descends over them in moments of genuine terror, and I always dismissed those accounts as the dramatic embellishments of men trying to make their stories more interesting. But I will tell you now that in that moment time did something very strange. It did not slow down exactly. It did something harder to describe than that. It became irrelevant. It stopped being a thing that mattered, and the only things that existed in the entire world were the sound of that breathing and the door and the 30 centimeters of frozen oak between us and the question of whether that oak was enough. The breathing continued for what my log tells me was 11 minutes, though I could not have told you if it was 11 minutes or 11 hours. And during those 11 minutes I became aware of something else. Something that built so gradually that I almost did not notice it until it was fully present, which was a smell coming through the gaps around the door frame, through the tiny spaces where the Arctic cold crept into the station every night, regardless of how well the gaps were packed with wool and newspaper. A smell that I can only describe as the smell of something very old and very wet and very wrong. Like frozen earth that has been turned over after a century of being left alone, like the inside of something that should not be opened. And then the breathing stopped. Not gradually, not with the natural trailing off of a creature moving away into the distance, but instantly, completely, as if whatever was outside that door had simply decided that it was finished breathing and had stopped. And the silence that replaced it was so sudden and so absolute that I actually flinched backward in my chair, as if the silence itself had struck me across the face. I waited. 1 minute passed, then 5, then 20. And then, at 4:51 in the morning, the telegraph machine began to click again, and this time the message that came through was only 4 words long. And those 4 words rearranged everything I thought I knew about what was happening to me in that station, because those 4 words were not sent in the telegraph code that Lars or Frederick or any human operator at Hammerfest would have used. They were sent in a pattern I had never seen before, a pattern that took me almost 10 minutes to decode, a pattern that suggested whoever or whatever was sending this message had learned telegraphy not from a human instructor but from listening, from somewhere outside a station very much like this one, to the sound of the machine operating through the walls. The 4 words were, "I hear you breathing." The first thing I did after I read those 4 words was check every lamp in the station, moving from one to the next with a speed that I am not ashamed to call desperate, checking the oil levels, adjusting the wicks, making absolutely certain that every single corner of that room was filled with as much light as I could produce. Because the message I had received the night before had told me that it hunted by sound in the dark, and I had decided, with the kind of cold and absolute clarity that only genuine terror can produce, that I was going to give it as little darkness to work with as possible for as long as my oil reserves allowed. Then I went to the shelf. I took down the book with no title and no name on the cover. The one with the frantic handwriting on the inside page that I had been too unsettled to read on my first night at the station, and I carried it to the desk, and I opened it under the brightest lamp I had, and I began to read. And what I read in the pages of that book over the next 3 hours changed the nature of my fear in a way that I can only describe as a transition from the fear of the unknown to something considerably worse, which is the fear of something you now know completely and wish with every fiber of your being that you did not. The book was not a book in any conventional sense of the word. It was a log, a personal log kept by not one but 3 previous operators of Telegraph station Nordcap, written in 3 different hands across the same pages as each man had picked up where the previous one had left off, and the earliest entries dated back to 1863, which meant that whatever had been happening at this station had been happening for at least 24 years before I arrived. 24 years of men sitting at this same desk, under these same lamps, listening to the same sounds outside the same door, and writing down everything they experienced with the desperate urgency of people who needed someone, anyone, to know what they had witnessed. The first operator, a man who identified himself only as H, had written his entries in a precise and measured hand that suggested someone trying very hard to remain calm, someone applying the discipline of a scientific mind to an experience that was systematically destroying his ability to think scientifically, and his entries in the early weeks were almost analytical in their detachment, careful observations about the sounds he heard at night, the patterns of behavior he had begun to identify in whatever was circling the station, the distances he estimated it was keeping from the building, and the way those distances seemed to be decreasing with each passing week, as if the thing outside was not hunting him, but studying him, learning him, cataloging his habits and his routines and his fears with the patient thoroughness of a predator that had absolutely no reason to rush. It was in H's entries that I first saw the word, written in capital letters in the middle of an otherwise carefully measured paragraph, underlined 3 times with a pressure that had nearly torn through the page, a single Norwegian word that I recognized from folklore, from the kind of stories that Norwegian mothers tell their children to keep them away from the forests at night, a word that I had always understood to be exactly that, a story, a myth, a thing invented by frightened people to explain the sounds the wilderness makes when the temperature drops and the darkness comes early and the isolation begins to press against the inside of your skull like something trying to get out. The word was skugvarg, shadow wolf, and beneath it, in handwriting that had by this point abandoned all pretense of scientific detachment and become something raw and jagged and barely legible, H had written 7 words that I read and reread until they were burned into the inside of my eyelids like a brand. It is not hunting us. It is collecting us. I want to tell you what I know about the skugvarg, not what the folklore says. Not the version of the story that gets told around fires and in warm rooms by people who have never been within 1,000 kilometers of the Norwegian Arctic in January, but what I know from those pages, from those 3 men who had sat in this same station and watched and listened and written down everything they could before whatever happened to them happened, because the truth of what the skugvarg is and what it does is so far removed from the campfire version of the story that they almost share nothing but the name. The folklore version tells you that the skugvarg is a wolf, an enormous wolf, a shadow wolf that moves without sound and hunts without mercy, and that is the part that is closest to the truth, the moving without sound part, because H and the 2 operators who came after him were all in agreement on this point, that the skugvarg, when it chose to be silent, was absolutely and completely silent in a way that no animal of its size had any right to be, that it could move across frozen snow without producing a single sound, that it could stand within meters of the station without disturbing the air around it, that the only evidence of its presence when it chose not to be heard was the smell, that deep and ancient smell of turned earth and something biological and wrong, and the way the dogs, on the occasions when previous operators had kept dogs at the station, would go absolutely rigid and completely silent themselves, not barking, not whimpering, just standing with every muscle locked and their eyes fixed on something that the men could not see. But the part the folklore does not tell you, the part that H had discovered through weeks of observation, and that the two operators after him had confirmed through their own terrible experiences, was that the Skugvarg was not simply a predator acting on animal instinct. It was not hunting because it was hungry, or because it was territorial, or because the presence of humans in its environment represented a threat that needed to be eliminated. It was doing something that H had struggled for pages to find the right word for, and had eventually settled on a word that I found more disturbing than anything else in those pages. More disturbing than the descriptions of what it looked like on the nights when it came close enough to the lamplight to be partially visible. More disturbing than the accounts of what it had done to the dogs. More disturbing even than the final entries of the second operator, which I will tell you about in time. The word H had settled on was deliberate. The Skugvarg was deliberate. It made choices, H wrote. It adapted its behavior based on what it learned about each individual man at the station. It understood cause and effect in a way that suggested a quality of intelligence that H, a man of considerable education and scientific training, found more frightening than any amount of physical threat could ever be. Because physical threat you can prepare for. Physical threat you can build walls against, and light lamps against, and bolt doors against. But intelligence, true intelligence in something that has decided you are its object of interest. Intelligence in something that is patient enough to wait, as long as it needs to wait, and has been doing so for longer than any of the men in that station had been alive. That is something that no lamp and no bolt and no wall of frozen oak will ever be enough to keep out. The second operator, who signed his entries only with the initials RM, had added something to H's observations that made me set the book down on the desk and press both hands flat against the wood and breathe very carefully for a very long time before I could pick it up again and continue reading. RM had written that he believed the Skugvarg was not interested in killing the operators at Telegraph and Nordcap. He believed it was interested in breaking them, one by one, methodically, with infinite patience, until the breaking was complete and whatever was left of the man who had arrived at the station was something that could be let out into the Arctic darkness without resistance, something that would open the door willingly, something that had forgotten every reason it had ever had to be afraid of what was waiting on the other side. And at the bottom of RM's final entry, written in letters so large they took up half the page, were 4 words that I sat with for a long time in the lamplight of that station, while the wind howled outside and something moved very slowly and very deliberately through the snow beyond the tree line. It waited for Haugen. I need to tell you about the third day, not because it was the day that the worst things happened, but because it was the day that I began to understand that what was happening to me was not a series of terrifying events occurring one after another in a sequence that would eventually end, but a single continuous process that had begun the moment I stepped off that dog sled and picked up my bag and walked to the door of the station, a process that had a beginning and a middle and an end that had already been decided by something far older and far more patient than I was. Something that had done this before and knew exactly how long each stage took and was prepared to wait for as long as each stage required. The third day began normally enough, or at least as normally as anything could begin in a place where normal had already been so thoroughly dismantled that I was no longer entirely sure what the word meant. I woke before dawn and checked the lamps and logged the overnight temperature at -43 degrees, and sat down at the telegraph machine and sent my morning report to Hammerfest, a brief and carefully worded summary of operational status that contained absolutely no reference to the sounds I had heard or the messages I had received, or the book I had spent the previous night reading with hands that would not stop shaking, because I had made a decision in the early hours of that morning that I was going to be very careful about what I communicated to the authority and what I kept to myself, partly because I did not think they would believe me, and partly because I had read enough of H's log to know that the moment the authority decided an operator was experiencing psychological exhaustion, they sent a replacement, and the thought of another man arriving at this station, arriving alone and unprepared, and with no knowledge of what was waiting for him in the darkness beyond the tree line, was something I found I could not bear. Lars at Hammerfest sent back a routine acknowledgement. Nothing in his message suggested he had sent anything the night before. Nothing in his message suggested he had any knowledge of the transmission I had received at 3:04 in the morning, the one with the warning about the Skugvarg and the instruction not to answer. And when I sent a carefully casual follow-up asking whether there had been any unusual transmissions from the northern stations in the past 48 hours, his reply came back in under a minute, and it was a single word: no. I sat with that reply for a long time, turning it over in my mind and examining it from every angle the way you examine a piece of evidence that refuses to fit into the theory you have been constructing. Because if Lars had not sent that first message and Frederick had not sent it, and the authority had no record of any transmission from the northern corridor in the past 48 hours, then the message I had received at 3:04 in the morning, warning me about the Skugvarg and telling me not to open the door, had not come from Hammerfest at all. It had come from somewhere else entirely, from somewhere out there in the 112 kilometers of frozen darkness between my station and the next human being, from something that had access to a telegraph machine and knew how to use it and had chosen to use it to send me a warning. And the question that this realization deposited in the center of my mind, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction until they touched every other thought I was trying to hold on to, was whether the warning had been sent to help me or whether it had been sent for an entirely different reason that I was not yet frightened enough to consider. I went to the window. I should not have gone to the window. I knew even as I was crossing the room that going to the window was exactly the kind of thing that H had warned against in his log, that presenting yourself as a visible shape in a lit window in the Arctic night was something the Skugvarg responded to in ways that H had described with a level of clinical precision that suggested a man trying very hard not to fall apart, while writing about something that was in the process of making him fall apart. But I went anyway, because there is a particular kind of dread that is worse than the fear of what you might see, and that is the dread of not knowing, the dread of sitting with your back to the darkness and feeling it pressed against the glass behind you like a held breath. And I needed to know. The Arctic night outside the window was absolute. The lamp behind me threw a cone of yellow light perhaps 4 meters into the darkness before the darkness swallowed it completely. And in that 4 meters of illuminated snow I could see nothing. No tracks, no shapes, no sign of movement, nothing but the surface of the snow lying flat and unmarked and perfectly white under the light, and I was just beginning to allow myself the smallest fraction of relief when I noticed something that collapsed that relief so completely and so instantly that I actually stepped backward from the window and knocked my chair over behind me. The snow directly outside the window was perfectly flat and perfectly unmarked, but pressed against the glass at exactly the height where a face would be if something very large were standing upright on the other side, was a single smear of condensation. Something had been breathing on my window from the outside in -43 degrees, and it had been standing close enough to do so without leaving a single print in the snow. I will not insult your intelligence by telling you that I slept that night. I will not tell you that I found some reservoir of professional detachment deep enough to allow me to continue functioning as though the condensation on that window and everything it implied was simply another data point to be logged and filed, alongside the temperature readings and the transmission records, because the truth is that by the end of the 3rd day at Telegraph Station Nordcap, I was no longer the person who had arrived there 4 days earlier. I was no longer the young and arrogant man of 26 who had accepted this posting with the casual confidence of someone who has never been genuinely frightened in his life and therefore believes himself to be the kind of person who does not frighten easily. That person had been dismantled with a patience and a thoroughness that I was only beginning to understand was entirely intentional. And what was sitting at that desk in the lamplight of the station on the night of the third day was something considerably more fragile and considerably more useful to the thing outside. The telegraph machine clicked at midnight. I did not want to look at it. I sat in my chair with my eyes fixed on the far wall and my hands flat on my thighs, and I told myself with every remaining scrap of rational thought I possessed that I was not going to cross the room and read whatever was being printed onto that paper tape, that I was going to do exactly what the first message had told me to do and exactly what every instinct in my body was screaming at me to do, which was nothing. Absolute stillness and silence and nothing, and I held that resolution for approximately 40 seconds before I was across the room and tearing the tape from the machine with hands that were shaking so badly I dropped it twice before I could hold it still enough to read. The message was longer than any of the previous ones. It was written in perfect telegraph code, standard Norwegian authority format, with correct headers and proper timestamps and all the procedural markers of an official transmission. And it said the following, and I am going to give you every word of it exactly as it was printed because I have read it so many times in the years since that night that I could recite it in my sleep and sometimes do. Operator Voss, we have been watching you since your arrival. You are doing better than Haugen did. Haugen opened the window on the second night. You have not done this. This is good. However, we need you to understand something that the log you have been reading does not tell you. Something that H and RM did not know because neither of them survived long enough to learn it. The Skugvarg does not want you to leave. It has never wanted any of you to leave. The postings at this station are not accidents. The authority knows what is out there. The authority has always known. The operators sent to Nordcap are sent because they are alone in the world. No family. No one who will ask difficult questions when they do not come home. Check your file. Check what they wrote about you. You were not sent here because you were needed. You were sent here because you would not be missed. Do not trust the authority. Do not send your morning report tomorrow. And do not, under any circumstances, let it know that you now know this. I set the tape down on the desk very carefully, with the slow and deliberate movements of a man who has just been told something that has rearranged every assumption he has ever made about his own life and is trying very hard not to let the rearrangement show on his face or in his body or in the quality of his breathing. Because I was beginning to understand something that RM had written about in the final pages of his section of the log, something about the way the Skugvarg responded to changes in the emotional state of the man inside the station, about how it seemed to sense shifts in fear and confusion and despair the way a current of cold air senses the opening of a warm door, and I did not want it to sense what was happening inside me in that moment, because what was happening inside me in that moment was this. I believed every word of that message, not because I had any evidence that it was true, not because I had checked my file or verified the claim about the authority or confirmed any of the specific details it contained, but because somewhere in the part of me that existed below rational thought and professional training and the carefully maintained fiction that I was a man who dealt in facts and not in feelings, somewhere in that deep and wordless place, I had known it from the moment Bjorn the Musher had driven away without looking back and left me standing alone in the snow outside a station that felt less like a workplace and more like a trap. I had known it, and the Skugvarg, standing somewhere out there in the -43-degree darkness with its face pressed against my window and its breath leaving marks on the glass that should have been impossible. The Skugvarg had known that I had known it, and it had been waiting with the infinite and terrible patience of something that has done this many times before, for the exact moment when I would finally admit it to myself. Outside the station, in the silence that followed the telegraph machine going still, something that had not made a sound in 3 days began, very slowly and very deliberately, to move. I want you to understand that by the time the 4th day arrived, I had not slept in 72 hours. Not because I was unable to, not because the sounds outside the station had been constant enough or loud enough to physically prevent me from closing my eyes, but because sleep requires a degree of surrender that I had become completely incapable of, a willingness to release your grip on consciousness and trust that the world will still be the same world when you return to it. And I no longer trusted that. I no longer trusted anything about the world I was inhabiting in that station, not the walls, not the lamps, not the telegraph machine sitting on the desk in front of me, with its paper tape and its impossible messages, not the log with its 3 dead men's handwriting, not the morning reports I had been sending to Hammerfest that Lars had been acknowledging with the cheerful efficiency of a man who had absolutely no idea what was happening 112 kilometers to his north, and most of all, not myself, not the version of myself that had been making decisions in that station for the past 4 days, because I had read enough of H's log to know that the Skugvarg's primary method of operation was not physical violence but psychological erosion, and I had been in its presence for 4 days, and I could feel the erosion happening. I could feel the edges of my thinking becoming softer and less reliable. I could feel the arguments I had been making to myself about rational explanations and professional detachment becoming thinner and more transparent with every passing hour, like ice in early spring, still present, still covering the surface, but no longer something you would trust your weight to. The message from the previous night had introduced a new and devastating variable into my situation. If what it said about the authority was true, if the operators sent to Nordcap were selected specifically because they were alone in the world and would not be missed, then there was no cavalry coming. There was no concerned supervisor in Oslo who would notice my absence and send someone to investigate. There was no mechanism by which the outside world would become aware of what was happening at this station unless I found a way to make it aware myself. And the only tool I had for communicating with the outside world was the telegraph machine, which was also apparently being used by something that was not human to send me messages from somewhere out in the Arctic darkness, which meant that every transmission I sent was potentially being intercepted and read by the very thing I was trying to escape from. I spent the first 3 hours of the 4th day going through my options with the methodical exhaustion of a man who already knows that none of his options are good but needs to lay them out in front of himself anyway, just to be certain he has not missed something. Option 1 was to stay in the station and wait for my rotation to end, which was in 159 days. 159 days of -40-degree nights and impossible telegraph messages, and something breathing on my windows from the outside and the slow and deliberate erosion of everything that made me capable of rational thought. And even if I survived all of that physically, even if I made it to the end of my rotation intact enough to leave, RM's entries had made it very clear that the Skugvarg did not allow operators to simply leave when their rotation ended, that it had a different ending in mind for the men at this station, an ending that involved them walking out into the Arctic darkness of their own volition, and that the entire process I had been experiencing since my arrival was designed to bring me to the point where I would do exactly that. Option 2 was to leave now, immediately, on foot, 112 kilometers to Hammerfest through -40-degree terrain, without a dog sled or sufficient provisions, or any certainty that the path I remembered from the journey in would still be navigable in the other direction, and with the absolute certainty that whatever was outside the station would be aware of my departure the moment I opened the door and would have every advantage over me in its own environment that I would not have. Option 3 was the one I kept returning to, despite myself, the one that the rational part of my mind rejected immediately and completely every time I brought it forward for examination, but that kept coming back, regardless, persistent and quiet and terrible in its simplicity, which was to send a message, not to Hammerfest, not to the authority, but directly into the darkness, directly to whatever was out there. A message that acknowledged what I now knew and asked the question that had been building in the back of my mind since I had read those final 4 words of RM's last entry. It waited for Hagen. What did it mean by that? What did waiting mean to a thing like the Skugvarg? And the question beneath that question, the one I had been circling for 4 days without quite allowing myself to land on it, was whether the waiting was purely predatory, whether the Skugvarg was simply softening its prey before taking it, or whether there was something else happening, something that H with his analytical mind had come closest to naming when he wrote that word, deliberate, something that suggested a quality of intention that went beyond hunger, and beyond territory and beyond any of the categories of animal behavior that my education had given me to work with. I sat at the telegraph machine for a very long time, and then I began to type, not to Hammerfest, not to the authority, into the darkness. The message I sent was 4 words long, and those 4 words represented the most consequential decision I had ever made in my life, a decision I have never fully been able to either justify or regret, a decision that changed everything that happened next in ways I could not have predicted, and that I am still, all these years later, trying to fully understand. The 4 words were, "What do you want?" The reply came back in 11 seconds. 11 seconds, which was not enough time for a human operator at any telegraph station within transmission range to have received my message and formulated a response and sent it back. 11 seconds, which told me with complete and final certainty that whatever was answering me was not doing so from a station 112 kilometers away, but from somewhere very much closer. Somewhere so close that the transmission time was nearly instantaneous. Somewhere that, when I allowed myself to think about it with the full and unfiltered clarity of a man who has run out of ways to avoid the truth, could only be one place. Directly outside my door, the reply was 6 words, "To show who you are." I am writing this from a room in Bergen in a boarding house on a street I will not name. On paper I bought this morning from a shop 3 streets away. With a pen I have checked and rechecked to make sure it is functioning correctly, because I need every word of what I am about to tell you to be legible. I need whoever finds this to be able to read it completely and clearly without any ambiguity, because what I am about to tell you is the most important thing I have ever written, and I am not certain I will have another opportunity to write anything after today. I left the station on the morning of the 5th day, not because I had decided to, not in the way that a rational man makes a decision by weighing his options and selecting the one that best serves his interests, but because something had shifted in me during the night after I received the reply to my message, something deep and structural, like a foundation stone that has been undermined so gradually and so thoroughly that when it finally gives way, the collapse is not dramatic but quiet, almost peaceful. The way ice does not shatter, but simply separates along lines that have been forming for much longer than anyone realized. To show who you are. I had read those 6 words perhaps 200 times between midnight and dawn, turning them over and examining them from every angle, and with each reading they had done something slightly different to me, had moved something slightly further from its original position, until by the time the sky outside the station window began its slow transition from absolute black to the deep blue-gray of Arctic. Pre-dawn I had arrived at a place inside myself that I cannot fully describe to you, except to say that it felt like the opposite of fear. Not courage, not bravery, not the hot and urgent thing that makes men do reckless things in dangerous situations, but something colder and quieter, and in some ways more frightening than fear, because it did not care about outcomes, the way fear cares about outcomes. It did not want to survive or escape or be safe. It simply wanted to know, with a hunger that had apparently been building in me for much longer than 4 days in an Arctic telegraph station. It wanted to know what the Skugvarg meant, what it had seen in me from the darkness beyond the tree line that had made it send me that reply, what it believed I was, that I had not yet understood myself to be. I put on my coat. I put on my boots. I checked the lamps one final time, not to make sure they were burning, but to make sure they would continue burning after I left, because there was a part of me that wanted whoever came after me to have light when they arrived. Whoever that would be, whatever condition they would find the station in, I wanted them to have light. I picked up the log from the desk, the one with 3 men's handwriting in it, and I added my own final entry in the space after RM's last words, and what I wrote was brief. Only 3 sentences, but I wrote them carefully and clearly in the best handwriting I could manage with hands that had stopped shaking sometime around 3 in the morning and had not started again, which I found more unsettling than the shaking had been. Then I walked to the door. I put my hand on the bolt. And I want to tell you what I heard on the other side of that door in the moment before I drew the bolt back, because it is the detail that I carry with me everywhere, that sits with me in this room, in Bergen, and walks with me through the streets, and waits for me at the edge of sleep every night. And it is not what you would expect. It is not the breathing, or the dragging sound, or the smell of turned earth. It is none of the things that had been terrorizing me for 5 days. It is something so much simpler and so much stranger than any of those things. And it is this: silence. Complete and absolute silence. The wind had stopped, making the walls creak. The Arctic itself seemed to have paused, to have taken a breath and held it. And in that held breath, in that silence so complete, it felt less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of something that had gathered all the sound in the world into itself and was holding it there, waiting. I felt something that I have never been able to name with any word that already exists in any language I know, something that existed in the space between terror and recognition, between the end of one thing and the beginning of something else entirely. I drew the bolt. I opened the door, and what I saw standing in the Arctic dawn on the other side of that threshold, standing so still in the blue-gray light that for a moment I mistook it for a shadow, standing at a distance close enough that I could see its eyes, eyes that were pale and almost colorless, and that looked at me with an intelligence so vast and so ancient and so completely devoid of anything I could call malice, that every story I had told myself about what this moment would be dissolved instantly and completely. What I saw standing there in the snow that bore no footprints, in the silence that held the whole Arctic world suspended, was something that looked back at me as if it had been waiting not 5 days but a lifetime, as if it had known from the very beginning that I would open this door, as if everything that had happened in that station had been not a hunt, but an introduction, and as if the thing it had come to show me, the answer to my 4-word message, was only just beginning. I took 1 step forward. The door closed behind me, and the silence that followed was the most complete silence I have ever heard, a silence that has never fully left me, a silence that I carry in my chest like a second heartbeat, steady and cold and infinite, the silence of a man who has walked through a door he can never walk back through and found, on the other side of it, not the ending he expected, but the beginning of something he does not yet have the words for. The station was found empty on January 3rd, 1888. No body was ever recovered. No footprints leaving the station were ever found, only incoming ones. And that is where the log of Emil Voss ends. Not with a scream, not with a struggle, not with the kind of violent conclusion that we tell ourselves these stories are supposed to have. Emil Voss walked through a door in the Arctic dawn of January 3rd, 1888, and left behind nothing but a burning lamp, a telegraph machine, and 3 final sentences in his log that the Norwegian Telegraph Authority sealed in a classified file for 37 years. Those 3 sentences were, "I understand now what it wanted to show me. I understand now why none of the others came back. I am not afraid. The building is still there today, standing exactly where Emil left it. Door closed, windows dark, telegraph lines buried under decades of snow. Nobody goes there. And here is what I want you to carry with you tonight. The Skugvarg did not hunt Emil Voss. It waited for him. It prepared him, and he walked through that door willingly and was never seen again, and left behind 3 sentences that suggest he was not sorry. That is the part that should keep you awake. Not the monster outside the door, but what the monster came to show him. If you made it to the end of this story, hit that subscribe button right now, because what we have coming next will reach into places this one did not touch. Every Thursday, without fail, without mercy, we will see you in the dark.